but could not, so we are recording the call from this point forward. And with that, let me just give you a little bit of background on why we're here today, and then I will, as I said, hand it over to our folks at FrameWorks. For this, I'm not sure how many people on the call know a lot about N-Square, but the brief version is that we have a mission over the next couple of years to build networks, to bring new partners and new ideas to a field that we can roughly describe as being about nuclear threat. And by that, we mean everything from nuclear safety and security, or safety and security of nuclear weapons, I should say, challenges to disarmament and proliferation. And so we are taking a broad look at what innovation looks like in the areas, and we're investing pretty heavily over the next few months in some research about not only what innovation is happening so that we can help to promote innovators in this field, but also how we can best talk to new partners and how our new partners can best talk to the public about these issues. And so we're engaging now in a series of research projects. The FrameWorks project is the first of these. We're doing analysis of existing research, including, for instance, the Topos work, which was excellent input to this process. FrameWorks will talk about the cultural models research that they have just completed. And we're using this as a launch pad for further research about the barriers and enablers to public engagement and action on the issues, which includes some reframing and remessaging research, which will follow on in the next couple of months. So for today, let me just say our job in building a network of new partners is to demystify some of the issues, and the purpose of today's call is to welcome new partners on this call. So this is a diverse group joining us today. We have folks from other sectors, we have funders in the call, and we have, of course, subject matter experts about nuclear threat. So I wanted to make sure that we understand that we're in this conversation with people who have varying levels of proficiency with the issues, but bring their own expertise as communicators and PR people and media people and technologists. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nat and Marissa from the FrameWorks Institute.
Thank you very much, Erica. This is Nat. While people are still not muted, can someone confirm that you can hear me clearly on the line?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Can I ask a technical question? I'm so sorry. So I just got out of it, and I'm trying to go back to the screen. It says I'm connected. Does anyone have any advice if you drop off to get back in?
I would log in completely.
Erica or Morgan?
Okay, sorry. ID, and then I'll stop. I don't want to stop this call just in case somebody else has this problem. Do we have a...
why don't we have Morgan resend you the invite so that you can log back in completely?
I have that. No, I have that. It won't let me log back in. I'll try to figure it out. Sorry about that. Go ahead. I'm sure I'm the only one. Go ahead.
Maybe we can send the presentation to Rachel too, Nat?
I can try. We're using our only machine here in the room to run the presentation, so that may be tricky.
Don't worry about it. I'll figure it out.
Okay. I'm sorry, Rachel. I will. We will do our best to with our voices enact all of the slides so that you're not missing anything.
Yeah,
I think you should be pretty okay with just our voices, and we will make sure at the very least to send you the slides after the presentation, and maybe one or two of us who are on the line that have all of this information can work on getting Rachel what she needs as I get going. But I'm going to get going just because we have 50 minutes left, and they're going to be 50 awesome, jam-packed minutes of talking to you about communicating about the various aspects of the nuclear issues, the nuclear threat issues that Erica set up in the beginning. I'm going to take a quick second just to tell you who we are. My name is Nat Kendall-Taylor. I'm CEO at FrameWorks. I am a cognitive psychological anthropologist by training, and I'm joined here with Marissa Fond, who is a sociolinguist and a researcher at FrameWorks. And what we're going to do is we're going to tag team this presentation. I'm going to go first. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we think that framing is an important thing for you all to think about. So I get to do the kind of boring background and theory stuff, and then Marissa will switch into the incredibly exciting and engaging results from the research, and tell you about the work that we've been doing over the last approximately 9 months on plotting public thinking about a wide range of nuclear issues. And Marissa will end with a set of emerging recommendations for how to more effectively position, frame, communicate about this set of issues to advance public understanding, to move the discussion, and to help people engage, as Erica said, with these with an innovation discussion around this set of issues. So with that, I will say just a couple of housekeeping things. I wanted to make sure people know that this call is being recorded. There should be a way, I can't see it on my screen, but there should be a way that you can type in any questions that you have as we go. And what we'll be doing, we have a colleague, Allison Stevens, who's in the office with us, who is kind of monitoring the questions as they come in, and we'll curate those and ask them back to Marissa and I at the end of the call. So we'll do our best to take as many of your questions and provide as many of our answers that we can at the tail end of the call. I'll go really quick. I promise not to talk any faster than I'm talking right now. I just had my afternoon cup of coffee, so I'm at full speed. I'll go for about 10 to 12 minutes, and I'll hand it over to Marissa, who will do, as I said, the kind of meaty, awesome part of this in talking about the results. And then hopefully we can have 15, 20, depending on how fast I talk, 10 minutes at the end to do Q&A. The only other thing that I will say is that there will be a report. There is a report that provides a lot more detail, background, and additional findings and recommendations that accompanies the presentation that we're making today, and that report will be released on FrameWorks' website, I think about an hour after our webinar concludes. So you will be able to access more detail about any and all of the findings that Marissa will be talking about in a written PDF copy of the report that will be available later today. And with that, I'll get started. And what Marissa and I want to do is take you through and try to answer the following 2 questions that hopefully, if our technology is working, you're seeing in front of you on the screen right now. So I get to do the, as I said, kind of the slightly more boring, dry question of trying to convince you that framing, and I'll tell you kind of what framing is, does matter to the work that you all are doing, given your wide variety of backgrounds. Hopefully I can make the argument that it matters to all of you who are on this call, that it is a very important, a small but very important and frequently overlooked part of what it takes to do the work that you all are doing better and do a better job of getting to the outcomes that you want. Then we'll switch gears, and Marissa will, as I said, dig deeply, as deeply as you can dig in 25 minutes into the results of the research, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to give you a couple of very quick answers to this first question, and hopefully convince you that framing does matter, so that you will listen with great interest to the research that Marissa is presenting. So the first reason why framing matters is this slightly academic-y statement that understanding is frame dependent. So this is a finding that I think kind of first came out of the field of political science. And what this means, to translate this, is that the choices and decisions that you all make when you talk about message and communicate about your issues, the small choices that you make and the pronouns that you choose, the verbs that you use, sometimes the large choices that you make in terms of the values that you endorse to talk about why your issue matters and what it's about, have effects on what people do as a result of receiving your information. They shape people's understandings, they inform their opinions, they move or in a positive direction, or as I'll show you in a negative direction, their support for specific policies. And so just to give you a really concrete example of exactly what I mean when I say framing, understanding is frame dependent, I'm going to tell you about an experiment that we've done in some work that we've been working on in the province of Alberta. So just a quick geography lesson, Alberta is one of the tall, skinny ones in the middle of the country. There you go. You know enough about Albertan geography for this to make sense. It's very rich in natural resources and oil. Traditionally a very conservative province. Recently, over the last 15, 20 years, some progressive pockets have emerged, people who are trying to move social issues in progressive directions. One of those pockets is a group of experts and advocates who are working on reforming the way that the province does addiction policy. And for a long time, this group had been having great difficulty, unable to move this set of policies, and about 5 years ago had the realization that a lot of the difficulty was due to the fact that there was almost no public support for this issue. So they were trying to move policy without public support and were failing miserably. We came into this situation as a way to help this group of advocates and experts move public understanding, create will and demand for policy change. As a part of this research, we tested a set of values messages to see how values affected people's support for specific policies. So what you see on the horizontal axis of the mildly complex graph in front of you are 3 values that we tested in this particular experiment, which is a large experiment, 6,000 people. And believe it or not, there are more than 6,000 people in the province of Alberta, but this was a representative sample of them. And what you see here is the value of interdependence, which was, in this experiment, people received this value, and it said something like, it's important to address addiction in this province because we're all connected. What influences one of us influences all of us. The value of ingenuity, which is the sense that this is a problem that can be solved, and if we as Albertans, we're going to roll up our sleeves and get to it, we can fix addiction in the same way that we have on other social issues. And finally, the value of empathy, which is the sense that we need to do a better job of addressing addiction because people who are dealing with addictions are people too. They could be our mother, brother, father, sister, whomever, and as individuals, they deserve our compassion and empathy. And what I'm going to show you here in 3 quick clicks are 3, what I think are beautiful blue bars appear on this screen, and those bars will show you the degree to which hearing these messages affects people's support for this specific set of evidence-based policies. So I can't do a drum roll, and I'm not going to ask Allison or Marissa to do one, but just imagine a drum roll. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. And you should, as I kind of let this sink in for a second, you should notice 2 things about this graph that are really important as we get into the part of this discussion that will focus on nuclear threat. First of all, you should notice that there are 2 values here, interdependence and ingenuity, which are making people, to a statistically significant degree, more supportive of this set of policies. So to translate, if you're an advocate working on addiction issues in Alberta and you use these values, you are advancing your issue, you are increasing the degree to which people support your solution. You should also be noticing the slightly less good news over here to the bottom right-hand side of the screen. The value of empathy depresses support for this set of policies. So to translate that, if you are an expert or an advocate working on addiction in the province of Alberta and you use the value of empathy, you actually make people less willing to support your policies. And the kicker is that in a subsequent piece of analysis where we looked at all of the field's external-facing communications, guess which value is used in over 93% of the materials. And this is a webinar. You can't answer this question, so I will answer it for you. It is the value of empathy. So what the field has been doing for a very long time with a lot of resources and a lot of money, time, and attention is forwarding a value that not only was wasted space and time, but was actually driving support down for the policies that these folks were advocating. So hopefully you take 2 things from the graph in front of you. One is that the framing decisions you make, whether you're talking about addiction or nuclear threat, have an impact on what people do as a result of seeing your information. Second, the fact that these choices, which value do we use in framing and presenting and arguing why addressing nuclear threat is so important, are empirical questions. These are not questions best addressed around a small conference room table by a group of experts who study nuclear issues. These are questions that we can target with social science research and come up with firm, evidence-informed answers to that we can then base our communication strategies around. So the second reason why framing matters, why you should listen to anything else that comes after my part here, is that we know that frames have and can be part of making change on social issues. Now, the graphic that you see in front of you on the screen right now is the theory of change that we at FrameWorks and lots of other people who are working on framing social issues use in thinking about our work. Now, it's important to say that this is not the only theory of change, but it is, we could argue, a part and has been part of almost every effort to use communication to create a movement to move policy and change outcomes. So the theory goes like this. If a field can change in persistent and consistent ways the ways in which it communicates about its issue, if they can change the frames they embed in their messages, that over time, those changes in field communication can shift the larger public discourse around the issue, and that with enough of that shift in discourse, the way that you hear in your case and in our case today, the way that people hear about nuclear issues when they turn on the news, open the newspaper, have conversations with, colleagues, fellow parents, whomever, that you can actually create meaningful, long-term, durable shifts in public thinking. And the idea is that with enough time, those changes in public thinking, you'll notice that I've said with enough time and over time at a number of points here, that those changes in public thinking create the space and put pressure behind policymakers to actually do different things when it comes to making policy on public issues. And this is, the theory that connects framing with policy and outcomes change. And this, I have a feeling, when we present this, this tends to be a slide on which most people have questions. So Allison is carefully monitoring questions as they come in. And if you have questions, please type them in, and we'll make sure to take as many as we can at the end. The final reason why framing matters is that, unfortunately, you have a problem. And it's not just you working on nuclear threat issues. It's anyone who's working on communicating, changing, shifting public understanding, moving public support for complex social and scientific issues. And it is a problem of perception. And it looks something like this. You, as an expert or an advocate working on nuclear issues, think that you have the most brilliant, logical, slam dunk message. I mean, it works with two of your closest colleagues. It's got to be brilliant. You take that message out to people who are not in your field, normal people, members of the public, and what comes back to you in the form of comments or what gets picked up by, particularly perhaps by journalists, is something that looks dramatically and fundamentally different than that which you had intended. So this is what we call the you say, they think phenomenon, the lost in translation effect. And just to make this a bit more concrete, pulling from some of the research that Marissa will be talking about, I want to give you a specific example that relates to issues of nuclear threat that comes from our work. So as an expert or an advocate working on moving and improving these issues and addressing nuclear threats, you may say something like this. Terrorists are trying to acquire nuclear weapons and capability, and having nuclear weapons actually does nothing to protect us from this threat. Now, we know that when this kind of a message goes out into the public sphere, into public thinking and understanding, what comes back is something that looks and sounds something like this. This is exactly why we need to keep, if not further develop, our nuclear weapons. They're our only hope for preventing crazy terrorists from pushing the button. And so what Marissa is going to do in the rest of this presentation is help you all make sense of why there is such, in this case, which for those people who don't work on nuclear issues, this may seem a subtle difference between the left-hand and right-hand side of the screen. For those who work on nuclear issues, this should be a fairly dramatic difference. This is clearly what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, not the intended effect of the message when this expert opened his or her mouth and decided to deliver this message into the public. So the question is that you all should be asking with great excitement at this point is, what explains this difference? What explains the difference between the intended effect of this expert and advocate message on the left-hand side and its actual reception among members of the public? And you should all have some idea of what this is based on the fact that I introduced myself at the top of this call as a cognitive or psychological anthropologist. The thing that stands between and explains this effect is culture. It is culture not in terms of physical artifacts in the world, but in terms of common, shared, deep, implicit understandings, what my people, what anthropologists call cultural models, that change, that mediate, that shape the way that people make sense of particular issues. So in this case, culture is the filter. It is the thing that is accounting for this difference between the delivery of the message and its actual reception. And what this does for us really clearly is it takes what is and has been the dominant a lot of communications and public relations, which is this sense that the public and the people we're communicating to are these empty receptacles, these blank slates, and we have the luxury of using messages that make sense to us and literally taking them out into the public sphere. And you should all now be able to discern from the last couple of slides and the tone in my voice that this is simply not an effective model to use in thinking about public understanding and is not an effective way to drive our communications. And instead of this empty fishbowl, false understanding of public thinking, at FrameWorks we use the metaphor of a swamp to think about public understanding. And the swamp here is meant to give us the sense that it is a rich, deep, complex, multiple set of understandings that people have access to and that they use frequently without knowing it to make sense of issues when we put issues in front of them. And it is our job as communicators to really know what's in this swamp and to become swamp experts in the way that we position and direct and frame our communications such that they don't activate unproductive parts of the swamp, but rather cue and hew towards more productive ways of thinking that people have access to. And this gives us a fairly simple equation to use in how we think about strategic communication. So the first step, and this is the step that Marissa is going to talk about in about 20 seconds or 15, depending on how fast I can spit out these last two sentences, is knowing what you're up against when you step out and communicate about an issue. So know before you go. That is one of the key components of being a strategic communicator. The second, which is work that we have not yet done on this project, is to do the work that you saw in the Alberta example, to actually develop and empirically test different ways of framing the issue to observe what they do in terms of the kind of outcomes that we're interested in moving, how our choices, specific choices, shape public thinking, move attitudes, and create support for the kinds of policies and solutions that we want to advocate for. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marissa, who will dig into the core of the research that we have thus far done on nuclear threat and nuclear issues. Take it away, Marissa.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I'm going to walk us through our cultural models research on nuclear issues. And again, I hope that if you have questions as I'm speaking, that you'll type them into the chat box so that we can answer them when we're all finished presenting our work here. So, as Matt said, cultural models are deep assumptions that people draw on when they're interpreting new ideas and making decisions. And so essentially they structure people's thinking. So it's important to remember that multiple models are always available when people are thinking about a concept, and some of them are more productive than others. Some, in fact, are unproductive, and we want to be able to anticipate and avoid those. And what we want to do is choose cues in our communications to activate the productive models and redirect the unproductive models. So let's talk about the models that people use to think about nuclear issues. Okay, so and I want to point out again, as Nat said, that we're only going to discuss some of the cultural models that we dove into on our webinar today. So we encourage you to go and read the full report for some more details on all of these issues, because as you all know, this is a very complex issue, and public thinking on this issue is complex as well. But let's start with the very basics, okay? So what do people think about when they think about the concept of nuclear? Very simply, the public thinks about energy and bombs and energy. There are these really deep connections between these two things, energy and bombs, in the public's thinking. And what's important here is that the public sees nuclear energy and nuclear weapons as pretty separate. And so what that means is that the public just doesn't see something like nuclear technology as inherently dangerous. So what's important about that is that there's a cognitive hole here in the public thinking. So there's a concept that the public can't or won't think about when they're thinking about your issue. So the public just won't be thinking about things like defective or aging weapons as dangerous. So what do we need to do about this? We need to develop explanations that fill this cognitive hole around nuclear technology so that we can start to form those cognitive shortcuts between weapons, technology, and danger. Okay, so as I present each of these cultural models, I'm going to give you a sense of what communicators can do now in order to understand, anticipate, and work around these models that we see. All right, so speaking of people's thoughts on danger, another important cultural model is a model that equates the concept of nuclear with danger. So this is really important because even though the links between nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and danger are so strong in public thinking, the public still supports nuclear energy and weapons to some extent. So they understand the danger, but they're not acting on that. So what do we do about this? Well, the important thing here is to go beyond danger in our messages. So if our messages are that nuclear capability is dangerous for, a list of reasons, many, many, many reasons, we're not going to see changes in thinking because the public's already there. They already think that nuclear equals danger. And the problem is that they don't know where to go from there. So they see the danger, but they get overwhelmed and immobilized by this problem. And this is why it's so important to go beyond danger and talk clearly and concretely about solutions. So every time you talk about a problem, you want to be talking about a solution to help bring the public along with you and flesh out the thinking on something like danger. Okay, so the public is already thinking about danger. We know that. So what else do they understand about the risks of nuclear weapons? So one very pervasive, very common cultural model that we've seen over and over again is this us versus them thinking. So there's a tendency on a lot of issues for the public to sort of divide the world into people who are like us and people who are other or not like us. Okay, so here, us versus them basically means, sane and responsible versus unstable and unpredictable. So the public thinks that nuclear weapons could fall into the wrong hands. And by saying that, by thinking that way, they imply that some hands are the right hands or the responsible hands or the good hands to hold nuclear weapons. And so it's really important to recognize us versus them thinking here on this issue, because when the public thinks of them or the others as unstable or rogue or completely beyond comprehension, then that means that the public won't see the point in engaging with policy solutions on this. Okay, so it's important to recognize this way of characterizing us and them, or the others in this situation. And another cultural model that relates to this is a metaphorical model that I'm sure you're familiar with. And we've characterized this as the button model. Okay, so the public thinks about the use of nuclear weapons with this metaphor. This is a very strong, very dominant model that people are using to think about risks. So the idea here is that in the public's thinking, nuclear weapons are launched when someone makes a sudden decision to press the button. So a sudden, impulsive decision to launch an attack. And this is important because the button metaphor, this model that people are thinking with, really limits how the public thinks about the danger of nuclear weapons. Okay, so it's not necessarily an unproductive model completely, but it's limiting in how people are understanding the risks. So they're not thinking about the complexities of the problem or about the systemic solutions that might solve the problem. So what do we need to do here? How do we need to manage this? We need to avoid talking about crisis at the individual level. This will just reinforce the button model and limit the way that people are thinking about risks. And we want to explain how existing systems do or can protect against nuclear threats. So how can we redirect thinking away from this unstable individual making a rash decision and explain how systems can actually be effective in protecting nuclear risks. And so now that we've talked a bit about problems, I want to talk about the public's cultural models of solutions. So what should be done? What do people think should be done? And here I want to walk us through 4 important cultural models that relate to each other in some ways. And so first, at the top here, is the tendency to draw a contrast between the ideal and the real. And so this is a very common, very fundamental cultural model that I know will look familiar to many of you on this issue. And so, as you can imagine, the public believes that solutions, so solutions like disarmament, may be ideal, but they aren't realistic or even desirable in the real world. And so why is this important? Why is it important to recognize this? Because if the ideal version of the future and the real are divided in people's thinking, it's going to make it impossible for them to engage with anything that they consider to be an ideal or a semi-ideal solution in the real world. Okay? This is a really important model that structures people's thinking about nuclear issues, and so this is one that's going to be a challenge for communicators to overcome. So another set of models, the second on our list here, is the blind trust in science model and the diplomacy deference model. So these are very much related. So the idea here is that essentially on nuclear issues, the public are ready to put their trust in science and government to manage the problem. And what is interesting about this on this particular analysis that we've done here is that we often don't see this kind of trust. Usually on the issues that we study at FrameWorks, the public are more distrusting of science and government. But here they hold this deep trust in the ability of science and government to manage these issues. And so why is this trust so important to recognize? This is important because it's another reason that the public won't engage with solutions. So in a sense, they see the issue as handled, and they trust science and government with the responsibility to fix this problem. And so there's no role for the public in this. The issue is under control. So the third model on our list here is this no going back cultural model. And this is one that will sound familiar to many of you as well, because certainly in our interviews, this is a very strong model that was characterized by very patterned ways of talking about this issue. So thinking about the cat out of the bag, the genie back in the bottle, all of these phrases that people use to express this idea. And so the public really strongly believes that since nuclear weapons are so devastating and so final, so dangerous, that there's really no going back to a time before, to a pre-nuclear time. So there's no way to invent something to replace nuclear weapons because nothing could be more deadly than that. There's no way to move forward here. And why is this important? This is really important because, again, this model in particular blocks any thinking about solutions and about innovation and invention. This is the way that people are seeing the forward progress. They don't see this as an issue where forward progress means something positive. Okay, so this is a big challenge for communicators. And finally here on this list, we have the deterrence cultural model. And this is a very big and important model, one that you've probably come up against before. And this model is so deep and pervasive in the public's thinking that it's really difficult to manage this one in communication. So the public really deeply believes that nuclear weapons are really the most powerful deterrent to nuclear attacks. So we previewed this in the slide that Nat described to you before, and the you say, they think model there. The public really believes on a deep level that the U.S. and the U.S.'s allies really could never give up our nuclear weapons because it's the only way that we are able to keep the peace. So remember that us versus them cultural model. This is the only way to maintain safety. And even when the public thinks that disarmament is the right thing to do or a good thing to do, the deterrence model is a huge block. This really holds them back from seeing disarmament as a viable solution. And so why is this important? I think that you can all intuitively answer that question of why this is important, but it's important because it's one of the biggest challenges for communicators in this space, and one that needs more research, certainly, as a way to counteract this very deeply held cultural model. But that said, what can we recommend that communicators do today to navigate around those 4 models that I just described? They can first be very careful to link disarmament with progress and innovation. The public isn't making those connections. So linking disarmament with progress and innovation rather than a pre-nuclear past. Okay, so we want to talk about the present, not the past and not the future, but make this an issue of the present. We also want to explain how disarmament works and why it would produce better outcomes. So we don't want to stop at saying that it will happen or it should happen, but we want to explain how it would happen, and that will make it more real in the public's thinking, because currently it simply isn't. And so one way to start to do this is to use reduction, the idea of reduction, as a way to initially engage the public. So the idea here is, while disarmament can sometimes fall a little too squarely in the ideal area of ideal versus real thinking, reduction is something that the public can think about more easily. So we can use this as a way to get to disarmament in our communications and explain how it works. And of course, finally here, we need to counter the public's deep fatalism, the fatalism that comes from that ideal versus real model of thinking. This fatalism needs to be met with a sense that there are solutions. There are things that we can do. This is really important in thinking about reframing the issue and building public will behind these goals. And so for our last topic here, I want to describe how in our interviews with participants, we explored questions about the issues that they were involved in and why and how they were involved in these issues. And there were some important models that came out of that work. So the public doesn't think of nuclear issues as a social issue of our day. As you can imagine, predictably, they see it as an issue of the past. They also, importantly, don't see nuclear issues as the types of bread and butter issues that they care about. So they're thinking about these bread and butter issues as things that affect people's daily lives. So things like income inequality, things that affect people's daily lives that they don't trust the government to manage effectively. And so these 2 models here, the social issue of our day and the bread and butter cultural models, why are these models important? They're important because they tell us how necessary it is, again, to frame disarmament as a current issue, not an issue of the past, not an issue of the future, but of the present. This is the first step and something that is really important to engendering engagement on these issues. And finally, there are important models that structure the public's thinking about nuclear issues and influence their lack of engagement in a sense. Okay, so let's start here with the tipping point cultural model. So the public thinks that even though nuclear weapons are dangerous, we remember that they equate nuclear with danger, we don't seem to see them as everyday dangers, as everyday problems. The public sees them as problems that only matter if something really terrible happens, that affects people's day-to-day lives. And in their mind, this hasn't happened. And so they ask, what's the point of engaging now on this issue? Okay, so the tipping point model is important to navigate when thinking about engagement on these issues. And then there's one last model here at the bottom of the screen that underlies a lot of the public's thinking on engagement with nuclear issues. And that is the fact that these issues to the public are just unthinkable. So on a deep, deep level, people are just in denial about this. They want to stay in denial about this, and they want to hope for the best in the future. This is structuring their thinking about what exactly we can do about nuclear issues. And so why is this important? You know, I think that you'll sense a theme in why these models are so important. Here again, we really need to be communicating about concrete solutions. explaining these elements of nuclear risk and disarmament to the public to mute this unthinkable cultural model and show that there is there's value in addressing these issues. So that is a very important task for communicators. And so there's a lot of work ahead of us to do, certainly, or for the field to do. But for now, there are things that we can do. And so here's a review of some do's and don'ts that we can incorporate into communications today. So we want to fill the cognitive hole around nuclear technology. We don't want to assume that people are thinking about nuclear technology or nuclear weapons accidents or aging weapons, things like that. We need to fill the cognitive hole there. We need to go beyond danger and get to solutions. So we don't want to emphasize the dangers and stop there because the public isn't filling in the gaps in the way that experts would. They are feeling overwhelmed or the sense of fatalism, and that's the end of their thought process on that. We do want to frame rogue actors, so people who are considered not comprehensible, as part of the solutions that we can envision through productive engagement. Okay, so we don't want to use us versus them language or strong rhetoric. We want to frame everyone as part of the solution. We want to develop strategies to explain state-level threats. So we want to show all the complexity of this issue and not rely on examples of rogue actors. We want to explain how systems and institutions do and can protect against nuclear threats. And we really want to avoid using momentary crisis frames. So, you know, the finger on the button, having the nuclear codes, the 3 a.m. phone call, and things like this that are so common in people's thinking. We want to really highlight systems and how they work. We want to explain how disarmament works and how it produces favorable outcomes. We don't want to simply assert that disarmament is good or right because, as we know, the public isn't going to fill in the blanks and go along with expert thinking on this. They're going to fill in the blanks by drawing on their cultural models. So we have to explain disarmament. And relatedly, we want to use reduction, this idea, to engage and increase support for disarmament. And rather than focus on disarmament as the only answer here, because that will put us into this ideal versus real way of thinking that can be a little fatalistic and unproductive. We want to frame disarmament as a current issue. We want to avoid talking about a return to a pre-nuclear past. We want to focus on the present. And we want to build a sense of urgency and efficacy to counter fatalism. So really, this is so important. We don't want to use this kind of crisis tone. We don't want to leave solutions underspecified. People understand the danger. We need to provide them with a sense of the solutions that are possible by working together on this issue. And so what can understanding cultural models do to help you with your communications? So you can think of these cultural models as tools to help you pre-flight your communications. So we're going to just end here with a quick example of how that might look. So here you see an example on your screen of a piece of communication that the public might very reasonably encounter. And we're going to read this very quickly together, and I want you to make any notes about what you notice in here, pluses and minuses, and we'll very quickly talk through this together. So nuclear weapons are the most dangerous weapons on Earth. One can destroy a whole city, potentially killing millions, and jeopardizing the natural environment and lives of future generations through its long-term catastrophic effects. The dangers from such weapons arise from their very existence. Although nuclear weapons have only been used twice in warfare, in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, about 22,000 reportedly remain in our world today, and there have been over 2,000 nuclear tests conducted to date. Disarmament is the best protection against such dangers, but achieving this goal has been a tremendously difficult challenge. So I hope that after our very brief run-through of our cultural models research, and I hope you'll go back to the report to read more, but I hope that you'll be able to notice some pieces of this very nice, well-written paragraph that can lead to different interpretations when members of the public encounter this. So let's go through this very quickly, and there are some things that I want us to focus on here. So this paragraph starts with danger very clearly. So we want to remember the public is already there. They know that the weapons are dangerous. And the paragraph gives examples of the harm to the natural environment and other long-term effects. The public knows weapons are dangerous, so we're not really giving them much new information here. And if anything, this sentence, in a way, is lessening the urgency because on a day-to-day basis, many of us won't see these effects, but we know that nuclear weapons are dangerous. So moving on, then we see that the paragraph mentions that weapons are dangerous because of their very existence. So you see that underlined there in green. So that's good because it's starting to fill that cognitive hole of nuclear technology, suggesting that it's not just their use, but their very existence that's dangerous. But the issue here is that we know that this is a cognitive hole, and so we need explanation here. Why are they dangerous due to their very existence? The public can't fill in those gaps reliably. This is a cognitive hole that we need to address. So let's look at the next sentence here. Weapons have only been used twice in warfare. So this makes it seem like the threat here is somewhat under control because we're going to think about our blind trust cultural model and our diplomacy deference cultural models, and we're going to think of how the public trust science and government on this issue. And so that's structuring their thinking here. We've only seen these used twice in warfare, so generally speaking, the threat isn't severe at the moment. And so we see here the last sentence, disarmament is the best protection against such dangers. And so what do we see in that sentence? So we see that this is a good strategy here. The paragraph needs to explain, though, how and why disarmament is the best protection against such dangers, because the public doesn't believe that this is so. We have that deterrence model that is making people pause and say that disarmament might not be realistic or possible. But the paragraph doesn't fill that in, okay? The paragraph says that disarmament is a challenge, which certainly it is. But the public will think that it's been a challenge because disarmament is ultimately not realistic, and that's why we haven't been able to achieve it. And so just to review, looking at this quick example, this short example, this is the kind of pre-flighting that you can do when you think about the public swamp of cultural models on nuclear issues. So there are things that we can do today to improve public understanding of this issue. And so with that, I know that that was a very quick overview of our research, but I want to provide us some time for questions and some discussion. So I'm going to ask if our colleague Allison, who's been looking at the questions that you've typed in there, can start us off with anything that we can try to address for you in our last couple minutes here.
Sure. Our first question is from Ken Longo. He says, please explain in more detail what the public's bread and butter issues are beyond income inequality.
Okay, that's a good question. Let me try to answer this for you. And having done a lot of these interviews, I certainly remember that people had a wide variety of interests. We interviewed people who are very involved and very engaged in a lot of important issues that face us today. And so some were things like, as we said, income inequality, but also climate change, the environment, human rights, animal rights, homelessness, this is just a list of things that that people brought up as things that are important to us on a day-to-day basis. And I think that what is really important in that is that these are very complicated issues. So they're certainly not things that are easy to achieve, but they're different from how the public see nuclear issues because they see them as issues that affect us all very deeply on a day-to-day basis. They see them as issues that they might not completely trust the government or our scientific institutions to solve. And they see them as things that they can influence in some way. And so it's really in going back to those cultural models that we start to see some of the reasons why people are willing to take on these really complex, difficult issues, but they shy away from taking on nuclear issues and supporting solutions like disarmament.
Our next question comes from Kathy. I think that a key cultural model is that nuclear weapons are out of our, quote, sphere of influence, like the weather. How do we convince that we can and should make a difference? It's our responsibility?
That's a good question, and it really does get to the heart of this framing challenge, right? Because people do believe that nuclear weapons are outside our sphere of influence. They believe that this is a matter for governments, our own government and our international institutions, as well as scientists who work on nuclear issues to solve. So they really do see nuclear weapons as outside of their sphere of influence, but we shouldn't necessarily believe that it's not possible for us to spark more engagement in nuclear issues, because the issues that people are interested in and interested in affecting change on are so, in some ways, outside of our influence as well. And so we need to try to find ways to really spark this sense of efficacy. And that starts with making nuclear issues an everyday concern of the present. So not something that's a relic of the past, and not something that we can just punt into the future to care about in 50 years from now. It has to be something that is very much tied into our present day concerns. And so that's a challenge for communicators, I think.
So this is Nat. Let me just add a quick point to that. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and when you look at all of the data and findings that Marissa has presented, it really, to me, gets to the core of the double whammy that is the challenge on this issue. So it's both a challenge of moving the issue up the ladder of salience among social issues in people's minds. So people consistently put this below housing, homelessness, poverty, equity, I mean, climate change, you name it, and it's above issues of nuclear threat. So there is a salience challenge, but to me, the more difficult part of the double whammy is inserting and creating, instilling, developing a sense, as Marissa said, of efficacy. So it will not be enough to get people to think that nuclear issues are really big, bad, important, and we need to address them if there isn't also, as part of an overarching strategy, a very strong and consistent drumbeat of not just statements that we can address this, you can be part, but actually of helping people imagine and envision what the role is that different types of people and at different levels and different jobs and different interests can play in this issue. And we didn't do a media analysis for this work, but I would guess that if you reviewed the media coverage of nuclear issues and even the field's framing habits, that there would be a dramatic lack of discussion and explanation of how people, not just these far-off state actors, can play a role in improving and addressing the issue. So I think, unfortunately, the takeaway at this point is a sobering one. It's a salience challenge. You've got to move the issue up, but simultaneously, There have to be communications and explanations, and particularly examples that concretize and explain the way that this issue can be addressed through different types of involvement and engagement. And I think that, I think that's a major framing challenge. It is doable, but multiple in its challenges, I think.
Our next question is, are the issues that we face different from other technically complicated issues? Are there lessons learned from the debate over climate change or artificial technology or other issues you worked on, or is the nuclear debate unique?
That's interesting.
Good.
That's a good question.
Good question.
Yeah, I think that there are some ways in which we see some parallels and some distinctions between nuclear issues and other issues that we've tackled at FrameWorks. So I think that, as I mentioned, one interesting feature of this research is that we see this desire to trust. People want to put their trust in science and government, and we don't see that with a lot of the other issues that we address at FrameWorks. And so there's some uniqueness to this issue in that way. We need to figure out a way, as Nat was just saying, to bring in the public themselves, to show that they have something to say here and can be part of the solution. And so I think that, some other parallels are the necessity for showing examples of solutions, because I think that that's something that is lacking here, and that makes sense because the solutions are difficult, but we need to see a way forward because people aren't seeing the issue of nuclear weapons as one in which progress and innovation will move us toward a future without nuclear weapons. They're seeing that as kind of counter to the forward movement of progress. They see us as unable to invent our way out of a nuclear future. And so I think that that's a really great question, and there are some ways in which this issue requires its own framing strategies in order to get around some of these challenges that we see.
So let me, is there another question? Okay, that's such a good, who asked that question?
R. Bronson.
Okay, it's a great question. Let me take 30 seconds to add some things to what Marissa was saying. So, I mean, I think that again, similarities and differences. Some of the similarities are that these issues that are complex and technical are very easy for people to put out of mind and not engage with. They're kind of seen as above my pay grade for most people in the public, and therefore, creating engagement and motivating people to be part of the issue is exceedingly difficult in some of the same ways that it is, when you're thinking about complex economic or climate change issues. But related to that, and it's another similarity, but it points to the need to actually do something specific. I think on some of these other issues, whether it's how the economy works or whether it's how climate change works, FrameWorks and a lot of other folks, and some of this is really complicated and there are nuances and caveats to what I'm about to say, but people have generally found that you can make people smarter about how these issues work, and that when you do, and this is the kicker, people get to seeing a different set of solutions as effective and have greater support for policy and programmatic intervention. So the important thing, I think, is to realize that people can get smarter about how issues work, and that part of our job as communicators and experts and advocates is not just to plead importance and demonstrate the extent of the problem, but it's actually to make people smarter about how our issues work and to kind of give the public the respect that they deserve in being able to become better thinkers about how issues work. The really interesting thing to me, which is where Marissa started, is that I don't think, based on this work, that science has been denigrated to the same degree and in the same ways that it has on a lot of other of the issues that you're probably thinking of ask this question. So climate change, I just have been looking at some work around kind of people's in the UK and in the US kind of very strong skepticism about economists when it comes to the economy. And, you know, we've done a lot of work around social science and just really strong public skepticism when it comes to science expertise, motivations, and that just didn't seem to be really questioned in the same way, to the same extent, with the same amount of cynicism on this issue. So I think that's a really, and that has obviously tons of framing implications that we'd like to explore around kind of how you position messages, who your messengers are, and yields a bunch of really interesting questions. But I will curb my enthusiasm here and take the last question.
Sorry, Allison, this is Erica here at Ensper. I just want to flag that we're close to the end of our hour, but it would be great for anyone who can stay an extra couple minutes to do this last question, and we have an observation to make at the very end.
Yeah, so we'll take one more, and then you know, anybody who's got to jump off, go ahead, jump off. I think there are maybe a couple of additional questions which we will jury and try to figure out if we can figure out who asked them and follow up with answers either to the group or to that individual in particular. But let's just do one more super quick. I promise to be quicker than I've been.
Rachel Staley-Grant asks, a framing that is used regularly in our community is about the financial cost of nuclear weapons, defense spending, etc. Did you get any feedback from the public on this type of narrative? Would it fall into a specific cultural model that we as communicators should use or overcome?
That's an interesting question, too. And I think that this is a difficult one to predict the public's response to. And I would say that on one level, the public are putting a lot of trust, again, in the government and in science, and so might well be willing to spend whatever is necessary. That's a possibility. It might also be an interesting, testable message. I think that it's a bit unpredictable given what we know about people's understanding of nuclear as so dangerous, as so important, as such a deterrent, as so crucial to safety in some respects. I think that the financial cost is, like, that message is unpredictable in this context.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the one parallel that we have, and I think it's the proximity to safety that would make me concerned. But I would say, before I try to answer this question, that is a great example of an empirical question, right? We could test that in the same way that you saw the Alberta research, and we could figure out, you know, how that is influencing outcomes in which you're interested in. But the area, the point that gives me pause, the other issue that gives me pause, is that we've tested a similar frame on criminal justice issues, both in the U.S. and in the U.K., kind of a cost-saving frame. And what we found is a strong, especially in the U.K., but here in the U.S. as well, a strong backfire effect. So people are not only are they not moved by that argument, but actually push back against it. And in subsequent qualitative research, it seems to be that criminal justice is an issue that deals with safety to a point where people kind of cringe and push back on this argument that we can even put a price on, you know, issues as fundamental as our physical safety and avoiding danger. So my hypothesis would be that the cost savings argument is likely to have a backfire, a negative effect on nuclear threat reduction issues in the same way and for some of the same kind of deep reasons that those messages have been problematic on criminal justice reform issues. And I think with that great question, you will notice that we said each of the questions was interesting and important, and they were really good questions. I think we will hand this back to Erica. Erica, if you want to say anything to bring us home, and then we will sign off and thank you all for participating.
Well, first, I just want to thank you all for doing really an exceptional work and being great partners in this work. We're very, very pleased to have had the chance to work with you. I know there's a whole lot more to mine here, so we'll take a look at whether we set up another conversation with those on this call to go deeper into some of the questions you might have, or even do a sort of reading group about the report once we have it and talk it through. We do find some of this very heartening at N Square because a lot of our focus is on finding ways to demonstrate specific and concrete ways for people from other sectors to engage with the issues. And to some extent, it's about, finding the connection points. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, for those people who are already working on criminal justice reform or they're already working on climate change or poverty alleviation, to be able to show them that they are, in fact, working on some of the drivers that could lead to nuclear conflict, but they may not be making those connections themselves, and maybe there's some value in making those connections. The final thing I'll say is that I believe that Nat and Marissa are sending out the report. We will send out the recording of this webinar to you and to others who would like it. And to that point, in the chat, you'll see an email you can use if you have any further questions about anything we're doing with the research program at N Square, or if you'd like us to stay in touch or stay in the loop about our work more generally. So info@nsquarecollaborative.org. And thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you all very much. Have a good day. Thanks, everybody.